This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on the evening of May 6, 2024. The National Post, Canada's leading fascist newspaper, just published a fascist tirade by none other than retired Canadian General Rick Hillier. The article, titled "Ottawa Abandoned Canadian Jews in Their Darkest Hour," is the subject of my latest rant of the week. Now, before we get into Hillier's shameless lies, Islamophobia, and deranged authoritarian fantasies, I should say a few words about the man's background. As a teenager, Hillier was so enamored with killing people that he sought to join the Canadian Army at 16 years of age. He submitted his application to join the forces in 1972. He initially wanted to be a fighter pilot, kind of the Canadian edition of Maverick and Top Gun, but sadly he failed his medical examination. He then applied to join the Canadian Forces as an officer cadet at the Royal Military College of Canada. Sadly, he was rejected. Several years later, Hillier's application to become an officer cadet was finally accepted. In light, however, of Hillier's subsequent military record, the Army's initial decision to reject his application for officer cadet status appears to have been the correct one. Eventually, nonetheless, Hillier became an officer and rose through the ranks of the Canadian military. In 2003, he was named Chief of the Canadian Military's Land Staff. Then in 2004, he commanded the NATO International Security Assistance Force in the deeply impoverished and relentlessly abused Afghanistan. In February 2005, Hillier became the Big Cheese, Chief of the Canadian Defence Staff. He served as Big Cheese until 2008 when he stepped down from the post. While serving as the Canadian military's Chief of Defence Staff, Hillier called terrorists, quote, "detestable murderers and scumbags," then added, poetically, "We're not the public service of Canada, we're not just another department. We are the Canadian Forces, and our job is to be able to kill people," closed quote. After stepping down as the Big Cheese in 2008, Hillier became Chancellor of Memorial University and embarked on an extended speaking tour for large corporate clients. Essentially, corporate bigwigs paid Hillier handsomely to flap his fascist gums. In 2020, the right-wing Ontario government of Doug Ford appointed Hillier as the chair of Vaccine Distribution Task Force for Ontario in response to a public health emergency, the COVID-19 pandemic. For some unfathomable reason, Ford concluded that a military man whose professed specialty was killing people was highly qualified to save them. For this dubious gig, the Ford government paid Hillier the princely sum of $20,000 a month. While serving in Canada's military, Hillier played a leading role in the NATO mission to destroy the country. More than 40,000 Canadian Armed Forces members served in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014. In 2006, on Hillier's watch, the Canadian military launched Operation Medusa, where did they get these names? An offensive in Kandahar province that involved more than 1,000 Canadian soldiers, making it Canada's largest combat operation in more than 50 years. Today, it can no longer be denied that NATO's war effort in Afghanistan was an embarrassing and catastrophic failure. In 2021, after 2 decades of brutal warfare, vast civilian casualties, countless atrocities, and trillions of dollars of military and other expenditures, NATO was driven from the country by the ragtag Taliban. The Taliban's arsenal was limited almost entirely to Soviet-era small arms. Its military spending was infinitesimally small compared to NATO's gargantuan trillion-dollar-a-year military budget. And yet, the Taliban kicked NATO's ass. With a military record like this, one would think that Canada's military, or media I should say, might question Hillier's competence. But no, the corporate media think the sun shines out of Hillier's ass, and with impressive frequency, they give Hillier a platform to pontificate on how to provoke the next war and lose it. With that as background, let us turn to Hillier's tirade in the national toast. His tirade begins with a series of bald-faced and bigoted lies. Here's the first one, quote, "Wanting to placate Islamic voters who are present in increasing numbers, Canada's government failed to condemn the hatred and is now frightened about what could come." Close quote. What planet does Rick Hillier live on? During the past 7 months, Canada's federal and provincial governments have constantly hurled false accusations of antisemitism at peaceful anti-genocide protesters, many of whom are Jewish. For example, this past February, Trudeau called a demonstration outside of Toronto's Mount Sinai Hospital a reprehensible display of anti-Semitism. The protest in question passed in front of the hospital on its way southward on University Avenue, and over the years, as I can attest, University Avenue has been used as a route for countless protests, many of which had nothing to do with Palestine. As the demonstrators in this protest passed in front of the hospital, there's no evidence that anyone did anything that could fairly be described as anti-Semitism. The worst part, however, of this rancid chunk of Hillier bullshit is that he's obviously stoking fear and hatred of Canadian Muslims, and in a national newspaper no less. Not only that, he's flatly misrepresenting the Trudeau government's attitude towards Muslim voters. Despite the January 26 decision of the ICJ that it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide, and despite countless pleas from Canadian Muslims that Trudeau respect that decision, Trudeau's government continues to buy weapons from Israel and to allow the delivery of military equipment from Canada to Israel. Moreover, after imposing sanctions on the Russian Federation with lightning speed in 2022, Trudeau has not imposed a single sanction on Israel, even though Israel has killed far more civilians in Gaza in 6 months than Russia killed in Ukraine in over 2 years. Trudeau's lavish support for Israel's genocidal regime has so alienated Muslim groups that in January of this year, the Muslim Council canceled a meeting with Trudeau, an unprecedented step, as a protest against his repressive pro-genocide policies. If Trudeau's support for Israel's regime proves anything, it's that he couldn't care less about Canadian Muslims. Here's Hillier's line number 2, quote, "Where are the political leaders, starting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, at synagogues and Jewish neighborhoods, frequenting Jewish businesses, directing enforcement of our laws during times reminiscent of Kristallnacht so long ago?" Close quote. Here's what actually happened on that horrific night, Kristallnacht. Jewish homes, hospitals, and schools were ransacked on a massive scale as attackers demolished buildings with sledgehammers. Rioters destroyed 267 synagogues throughout Germany, Austria, and the Sudetenland. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and incarcerated in concentration camps. Since October 7th of last year, not a single Jewish person in Canada has been rounded up and placed in a concentration camp. No synagogues have been destroyed. A very small number of synagogues and Jewish-owned businesses appear to have suffered minor vandalism, but there's little evidence that this minor vandalism was committed by Palestinian solidarity activists, again, many of whom are Jewish, and the vast majority of whom are entirely peaceful. In these circumstances, no honest and sane person would say that conditions in Canada today are reminiscent of Kristallnacht. Line number 3, New Democrats have supported not Palestinians, but Hamas. The BC NDP abandoned one of their own, not because she's horrible, but because she's Jewish. And on Passover, a special time for Jews, the Ontario NDP chose to push the issue of wearing the keffiyeh, which has become a symbol of terrorism, in Queen's Park. Closed quote. The keffiyeh, Mr. Hillier, is a cultural symbol of the Palestinian people that has been around for a very long time, and your allegation that it is a symbol of terrorism is racist to the core. Moreover, here's an example of what comes up if you Google the words NDP, Hamas, and condemn. Any of you can engage in this exercise. This is from an October 13, 2023 statement by the federal NDP, and I'm quoting, "We condemn Hamas's call to arms today, which will inevitably lead to more violence. We reiterate our unequivocal condemnation of the terrorist violence by Hamas that killed thousands. These attacks have caused unimaginable pain and trauma for Jewish communities globally and made Jewish Canadians feel unsafe. This must end." This is what Rick Hillier calls support for Hamas. Hillier goes on to claim that the BC NDP abandoned one of its own. Here's what actually happened. BC NDP leader Dave Eby removed Selina Robinson, the BC Education Minister, from her portfolio after she made a blatantly racist remark about Palestine. Specifically, Robinson said that Palestine was a, quote, crappy piece of land with nothing on it, close quote. In Robinson's racist view, the Palestinians who lived on that land at that time and who had lived on it for centuries with their ancestors amounted to nothing. in a principled political party, Robinson's anti-Palestinian smear would have been an automatic firing offense, especially for an education minister. Instead, it took weeks of intense public pressure, much of it from anti-Zionist Jews in Canada, to remove Robinson from the education portfolio. Meanwhile, the Ontario NDP disgraced itself by expelling MP Sarah Jama from its caucus. Sarah is a Somali-Canadian Muslim and a disability activist. She was elected to the Ontario legislature as a member of the NDP in 2023. On October 10th, 2023, around the time that Israel's leaders began declaring their genocidal intent openly, Jama made a social media post calling for an end to Israel's occupation and apartheid. Now, the fact that Israel is an apartheid state was documented years earlier by both Israeli and Western human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch. All of this was undoubtedly known to the leadership of the Ontario NDP. And yet 2 weeks later, the NDP removed Jama from its caucus, with party leader Merritt Stiles stating that Jama had taken, quote, a number of unilateral actions that have undermined our collective work and broken the trust of her colleagues. According to Rick Hillier, all this amounts to NDP support for Hamas. Now, what drug is that man smoking? It must be some really bad opium from his days as a failed military leader in Afghanistan. Now, after spewing his shameless lies, Hillier offers a few recommendations to Canada's government. They include this doozy, quote, help contain Iran. There is only one war in the Middle East, and that is the one being waged by Iran. Canada should flex its international muscle. We should push for the return of severe sanctions to contain Iran and designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as the terrorist group it is. Canada is being set ablaze from the Middle East. Fiddling while our country burns will destroy us all. Oh, Canada! Close quote. Yes, folks, Rick Hillier actually wrote those comments, and the National Toast actually published them. First of all, how can you talk about Iran without talking about the fact that the West overthrew its democratically elected government in the 1950s and then installed the brutal Shah as its vassal? Why did it do this? Because the democratically elected president of Iran wanted to nationalize the Anglo-American oil company for the benefit of the Iranian people. How can you talk about Iran without talking about the murder of Iran's nuclear scientists, or the Trump administration's murder of Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani, in 2020, or Israel's destruction of Iran's consulate in Damascus last month? When it comes to terrorism, Iran is a pipsqueak compared to Israel. Israel has slaughtered more than 15,000 Palestinian children in less than 7 months. If that isn't terrorism, nothing is terrorism. Finally, if Hillier wasn't smoking bad Afghan opium, he'd know that more Canadian sanctions on Iran will have no effect whatsoever on Iran's behavior. It is now beyond obvious that Iran has learned how to cope with sanctions and is increasingly integrated into BRICS, which rivals, if not surpasses, the Western Bloc in economic, military, and political power. Hillier, an intellectual Lilliputian, seems oblivious to all of this. Here's Hillier's next recommendation for the Trudeau government. Stop funding UNRWA. UNRWA has long been known for providing sympathy and support for Hamas. UNRWA is part of the murderous problem, not the solution. Funding it means we are funding terror. Close quote. I wonder, does Hillier read major Western newspapers? If so, he'd know that Israel has produced no evidence whatsoever to support its allegation that a small number of lower-level UNRWA employees participated in the October 7 attacks. Also, when it comes to sustaining Palestinians, no aid organization is as effective as UNRWA, which has for decades provided extensive humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people, not only in Gaza, but in refugee camps throughout the Middle East, with an abundance of infrastructure, much of which has now been destroyed in Gaza by Israel. At the time when Israel has put the civilian population of Gaza on the brink of mass starvation, and children are undergoing amputations with no anesthetic, no one but a sadistic psychopath would urge the Canadian government to cut off funding to this critically important aid organization. Here's Hillier's final recommendation. Enforce our laws. We have plenty of laws in this country, hate laws, threat laws, violence laws, and more. Yet almost none of them have been employed to protect our citizens. Police should arrest Canadians who thumb their noses at our laws and deport those who are not Canadian. Now here's a thought. Let's petition the Canadian government to strip Rick Hillier of his Canadian citizenship and then deport him to Israel. In Israel, Hillier will be right at home with his fellow fascists. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece with my latest rant of the week on May 6, 2024.